Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade, and this is the Education Show. I'm delighted to be here today with Emma Pettit from the Chronicle of Higher Education. Emma, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
For people who might not know you, your outlet, or your beat, can you tell us the three-sentence version?
Sure thing. So I work for the Chronicle of Higher Education. It is a trade publication that covers all things American higher ed. So research, academic freedom, politics, enrollment crunches, any issue affecting a campus in the United States, we cover it. I specifically write about these days conservative and right leaning, though sometimes liberal as well, criticisms of higher education. I try to take those criticisms seriously, and I essentially am asking over and over, why has higher education lost trust with some of the public? What are some of the reasons? And trying to look at that access or look at those answers through my work.
Excellent. And how long have you been on this beat? And what do you call it? Do you call it the Trump beat? What's the in-house name for the? It's a really interesting beat.
Yeah, I don't really call it the Trumpies so much because I have colleagues who I think cover the more day to day or some of the kind of Trumpian developments, like the aggressive threats to research funding and threats of deportation over speech, that sort of thing. So I call it the critique beat, I guess. I've got in general, I talk about how political ideas show up and appear on college campuses. It's a pretty wide gamut, but I like that. I like that it gives me a lot of freedom, and the Chronicle here gives me a lot of freedom to kind of look and pick and choose what stories I think are the most interesting for our audience. I've been on this particular area of coverage maybe for the past 2 years or so, two or three. Before that, I was like the faculty beat reporter, so covering again, academic freedom disputes, but more of the day to day lived experience of faculty on campuses.
Before we jump into your stories, which have just been recognized as finalists for EWA, let's talk about the education beat overall and specifically the higher ed beat. Can you give us 2 cents on what the state of the higher ed beat is right now?
Oh, I should have thought about this a little more before coming on. I think that, in general, higher ed gets not a lot of love in other newsrooms. I mean, the Chronicle's bailiwick is higher education, obviously, and we have competitors like Inside Higher Ed that are entirely devoted to higher education. And, we have 20 or so reporters in our newsroom who some people just cover admissions or just cover, research or just cover enrollment. And it gives you this like depth of knowledge there that you can really bring to the table. Sometimes when I read higher ed coverage in big outlets, I don't see sometimes that depth of knowledge. I think coverage can kind of be swayed towards like the big elite institutions, which makes sense. Like they make a lot of news. People really recognize the name Harvard over like, North Idaho Community College or something like that. But I think that can kind of skew the focus. I think that sometimes my general feeling is that criticisms of higher education have not gotten a ton of shine in certain ways until recently. So I think that gets a little bit less love than it should. And with daily newsrooms, they're very good higher ed reporters who are on the ground covering their local campus system very aggressively, and that some of that expertise, some of that focus, I think, dissipates. The higher and more extracted you get from those campuses.
Speaking of attention and interest in the criticism of higher ed, for people who don't follow higher ed closely, what are the hot topics in higher ed right now? What are the topics that you think people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, great question. Well, it's hard to avoid criticisms of higher education because I feel like they fill my airways. But yes, for people who aren't familiar, there's some big strands of criticism that I'll get into briefly. One is speech and censorship on campus, and so there have been many, many disputes, many debates, many instances of either students or professors, canceling speakers who have offensive to some ideas, of not letting certain classes be taught, of debating what students are allowed to say in the classroom. There's a huge concern around speech and around the health of speech on campus. And that's particularly acute because colleges, we imagine, are the places where you go to debate, you go to figure out what you think, figure out what's not like allowable to think, but you would hope that kind of the reins, the Overton window of speech would be the broadest at institutions that are meant to foster that debate. And there's been this real sense, I mean, for decades, going back decades, but especially over the past 10 or so years, that anything that is not in line with a particular like progressive worldview is squelched. So that's a big one. Another big one is cost, is the sticker price of college. I'm sure listeners are really familiar with that. I mean, everyone is familiar with the rising cost of college. I will say that like often the sticker price doesn't reflect what families actually pay, but a lot of universities have gone with this kind of like high tuition, high aid model where you're looking at $60K a year sometimes, and that might be really discounted for families that need it, but still, it's a hefty price tag. Student debt and the cost of college is a big criticism, and whether degrees pay off too, whether you are graduating from college and you have a degree that's worth something. That particular criticism has gotten super, I guess, intense, or has become, on the right and the left too. And then the last thing is admissions. That is really on, elite colleges, like most colleges, except, the majority of people who apply. But for the Ivies, the Ivy Plus, a focus on who gets in and why, affirmative action, legacy admissions, after the Supreme Court case, knocked down race-conscious admissions. Still, there's a lot of unknowability, or just people feel like they don't have transparency into why, someone gets in and someone doesn't. So those are kind of three big buckets of criticisms that I think, filter out into the public, but is a good primer for the criticisms of higher ed in general.
Excellent. I want to talk a little bit about the EWA recognized stories, and just in case I get fuzzy or freeze up, don't worry about it at all. Riverside is recording us both locally, and it's going to go up into the cloud and synchronize in beautiful HD. So don't worry about that at all. You have been on my radar, even though I don't closely follow higher ed, partly because you're a journalist who's still on Twitter. Thank you so much for staying or returning. Partly because you seem to be willing to poke the bear or the bears on the left or the right in a way that a lot of news and beat reporters don't always seem able or willing to do or want to
thanks.
do.
I appreciate that.
And then oh, good. Does that match up with your sense of what you're out there doing?
Yeah, I think that I don't try and start stories deliberately trying to be provocative, but I do think that there are a lot of questions worth asking that sometimes get a little bit less shine. And I definitely see my role now, as trying to ask those questions and trying to explore debates, not just like both sides, but like all sides. I try and embrace that. And I think that description matches kind of how I see myself a bit.
Oh, good. What I really appreciate, and this is me editorializing, is that your coverage doesn't seem to have a knee-jerk rejection of critiques of the status quo, or it doesn't seem like resistance journalism. It seems like, hey, let's check this out and find out what's in between. And the two stories that I had the chance to read over the weekend that EWA has made you a finalist for are fascinating. One is a field reported, very glossy magazine vibe. I felt like I was reading something in, I don't know, Vanity Fair.
Yeah,
where you go
thanks.
down and visit new college. That was a very magazine-y piece, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, it
And then the
was.
other one, and then full of literary references and metaphors and a beautiful kicker. And then the second one I read was more of a grind, a FOIA, what's really going on behind the scenes of reevaluating Gen Ed in Florida. Um, I have just recapped, I guess, the two stories, but why don't you say a little bit more about them and where they fit in your work and how they stand out for you?
Sure thing. So I'll start with the first one, the New College of Florida. So, in a nutshell, New College of Florida is this tiny liberal arts college, public liberal arts college in Florida on the Gulf Coast. It was known for being, granola crunchy, quite liberal. Imagine, the type of students that go there. It was this haven for students who saw themselves as like oddballs and maybe not totally fitting in. You could go to New College
Right.
and find your place. And in 2023, Ron DeSantis, the state's Republican governor, who was then running for president or maybe about to announce, I can't remember the timeline there, he ushers in this overhaul of the board there. He appoints these right-leaning trustees. It's a majority, and they are taking New College in this totally different direction. And the narrative at the time, emanating from his office and elsewhere, was we are taking back this, woke liberal arts campus that's gone off the rails. This is a reassertion of, conservative values or just values that reflect the Florida people. And, this campus has gone totally off course and we are correcting it. And we're turning it in this rightward direction. And there was a ton of protest, as you can imagine, from faculty and students there. But the campus also got a lot of money. DeSantis and the new president, Richard Corcoran, who's just this like creature of Florida Republican politics. They essentially, New College got like tens of millions of dollars more in funding to help it through this transformation. And I started that story asking myself, like, okay, there's been a ton of coverage of this takeover, all, slanted towards it being a negative or kind of a foregone conclusion that it's going to be a bad thing. And I completely understand why people there were upset. Like, I don't say that to dismiss the feelings of faculty, students, alumni who are all being told that, their place was too woke and it needed to go through this change. Regardless of your politics, I think anyone can understand why that would be really bracing. However, I was interested in the idea that what if this works out, or just what happens? What happens when some of the news coverage dies down
Right.
and a college actually tries to change itself, and like in what way is it trying to change itself, and like could there be ways in which this works out, and also did the college have problems, the new trustees would talk about this kind of censorious environment and declining academic standards, and the place also looked like kind of dingy. It didn't have a lot of money, and so that's where I started with that
Right.
story. And I think the story that I ended up writing, it was interesting. People had tons of different responses to it. Some people were like, thank you for displaying what a horror show this college has become. And other people were like, oh, this actually challenged my ideas about New College, and like maybe things aren't going so bad as I thought. And that was really gratifying, I guess, to hear those different responses. Like, I want people to have different responses to my work based on their own,
Mhm.
ideas
Mhm.
and backgrounds. The other
Exactly.
story, I'll be a little shorter. The other story is also in Florida. A lot of stuff happening in Florida. And it follows a reform law that changed general education in that state. So, Florida lawmakers, conservative lawmakers, passed this big higher ed bill, changed a lot of things. Gen Ed was one of them. I don't have the exact wordage of the law in front of me, but it basically said that, courses that um, are too ideologically biased, or that like assert ideas of structural racism uncritically, those sorts of things cannot be included in public colleges' general education catalogs. And a lot of colleges have like dozens, hundreds of courses in those catalogs. So it set off this chain reaction where, okay, lawmakers are saying you can't have this sort of bias in these courses. They can't be, superficial. They can't be non-foundational. Also, how do you go about like pruning those catalogs? Like, how do you actually take this law, these few paragraphs, and turn that into policy? And myself and a colleague decided to look at that in a really granular level. And essentially, what we discovered is that, there was this kind of opaque process where the state university system was like going through spreadsheets, it seemed, and like flagging courses that didn't align. And, some got booted because they were like high level courses. I think there was one about like samurai fighting or something like that, which you wouldn't assume would be in gen ed. Some got booted because of their ideological valence. They were about gender or race in a way that conflicted with that law. And in terms of how I think about my role, I wanted that story to show what we found, which was this like confusing process, like who is deciding what conflicts with this law. There's plenty to look at, there's plenty to criticize there. But we also wanted to include at least perspectives of people who say, like, these colleges have let their general education curriculums just balloon and get kind of crazy. And like, well, is there an argument for general education being really foundational and not branching into some of this other territory? So that, yeah, that was the thinking there for both of those stories.
I loved both of them. They were very different. I love that they made me think. They didn't buy into the notion that the critique was impossibly wrong on the face of it, or that there was a bloodbath or all negative outcomes. Reminded me of the Harvard Plan, which is a podcast on the media about reconsideration and reevaluation at Harvard, which also made me think. And it also reminded me of a story, a sort of a look back at the Biden administration's COVID response, heroic and flawed, and really got us, especially in the story about gen ed, really got us into the bureaucratic crevices of how decisions get made. Is that what you're going for? Is that a Chronicle-wide thing or a Emma thing? This insisting on looking at what actually happens rather than deciding based on who has initiated the idea.
Yeah, I think that is a value that I've come to appreciate more and more as I've gone on in journalism. I think I've shifted more in that direction, certainly. And I think that just part of that comes from just age and time doing a bunch of stories. I think that the journalism I find the most interesting is where I can feel myself seeing and understanding different parts of a debate, even if I exit some story feeling, exactly as I did going into it. But I also like when I change my mind or like when I have my views challenged. And I just think that makes for better journalism in general. I have colleagues here who do that really well. Stephanie Lee comes to mind. I just shared, she did this story about Joe Bowler, who is this mathematics professor, this professor, I believe at Stanford, and has been kind of embroiled in these various like education debates over how we teach math. And, her work in that and in some other places really walks through like, okay, what are the criticisms? What are the defenses? It's very thorough, and it kind of, you can feel yourself kind of being led through this landscape, and someone is pointing out to you all these different trees, and like they're willing to point out like, oh, maybe that's not that pretty over there, but like, oh, look at this view that other people appreciate. And it's through that process that you get a sense of reality, I think. And I never want a story that I'm writing to feel like I'm this like, I don't know, real estate agent who's trying to sell someone something. And I'm like, well, don't pay no attention to the, noise outside this, like, pay no attention to the fact that this house is right next to an interstate. What I care about is this like gorgeous view or whatever, like I think the role of a journalist, and I think the Chronicle's work could really do this, is like showing people the complexity of the world, which is hard. It's a hard thing to do, but I think that those are like, when I look at my colleagues' work that I really admire, like those are the stories that really stick with me, and I like to be challenged, or I like to change my mind.
And you clearly like to challenge your readers and see if your readers are willing to change their minds. Let's talk a little bit about there are in some ways some parallels between the critique of higher education and the critique of journalism, right?
Totally.
And I'm curious about your thoughts about whether the critique of journalism, if you can bring the same thoughtfulness and scrutiny to that topic, based on your experiences, what you've written, what you see, is the critique of journalism often from the right, though there's some from the middle and the left who share the critique. Is the critique warranted, worth examining? Should it be dismissed? Should we ignore the critique?
Oh, definitely don't ignore. I'm such a do not ignore your haters like that. If I can get one thing across, I really think, no, I think that criticisms of journalism should be taken really seriously, and maybe even in some cases more than higher education. I mean, you want to talk about public trust. Whenever I'm writing about public trust in higher education, sometimes people point out to me totally fairly that journalism's numbers are like in the toilet. And I think a bunch of things about that. I think that it is absolutely true, in my opinion, that most journalists, I think based on polling or based on the data we have, lean to the left. I think a lot of journalists come from, elite institutions or these like elite backgrounds. And that just means that like, it's like anything, like you get a bunch of people who are liberal or left leaning in a room, and just the critiques or the ideas or the experiences that would naturally occur to someone who is conservative or libertarian or whatever, they just don't come up in conversation in the same way, And I think that like when people are really critical of the media and its bias, especially its left leaning bias, I hear all that. I also think that it's more of this like organic, less conspiratorial thing than people think. Like right now, because I read so much that's from people on the right, sometimes I think people think that like there is this like cabal or organization between these different news outlets of like how to cover something and what to cover, and like, oh, these stories are kind of coming out on the same day with the same angle, and like that means that like they don't want you to think about something or ask about something. And the point I want people to know is that like, oh, it's a lot like dumber than that. Like it's a lot like, it's just a bunch of people like trying their best, but also like who are in bubbles sometimes, or are just coming to the same conclusions because we're from similar backgrounds, and not having an adversarial, in a good way, like discussion about stories and that sort of thing. I also think that there's just like structural reasons why maybe it's gotten harder to do good work. And like if you're responsible for writing 3 or 4 blog posts a day, or really having to churn out content, you don't have the time to look into something deeper with skepticism, talk to different people, talk to people who feel really conflicted about something, which is how I think the truth eventually comes out. And so I both agree with a lot of the criticisms, or at least think that they should be taken seriously. I also think that there's kind of other stuff going on. And yeah, I generally think that like in general, journalists should take those criticisms really seriously. I mean, in part just because of like the sheer like we want people to engage with our work, and engaging with that work like relies on trust and at least some strand of people thinking we might know what we're talking about or we're acting in good faith. And when that's eroded,
Mhm.
it's hard to come back from.
Right, exactly. One of the things that people point out in the critique of journalism is the bias issue, and the other is what I'm going to call the format or stylistic approach issue, which is we'd like to get our news on video via social media from people who we trust who might or might not identify as journalists. I'm curious a little bit about what you think about what I call non-traditional journalists, people who are trying to provide generally accurate information, but not didn't go to J school and don't identify that way. And I'm also curious, are there any non-traditional folks in the higher ed sphere who are out there doing a journalistic job that we should know
Mm,
about? There are a bunch in K-12, folks who are doing Substacks or TikToks or whatever, who have gotten an enormous amount of attention and interest, and are journalism-esque. And I am not a purist. I didn't start out as a journalist, actually, and I think that we should welcome them and learn from them. But I'm always curious about what real live journalists have to say about it or what they're seeing. So tell us.
yeah, no, I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, I think journalism, the way I think about it is like it's a trade. Like I really learned how to do it on the job. I kind of believe that like anyone could do it with, if they have the desire, if they have training, and if they're able to kind of like sweat it out and try. And like you're gonna make a bunch of mistakes, and the goal is just to make less mistakes as you go along. But yeah, I mean, I both think that like the principles of journalism are really important, of like, you get comments from anyone mentioned in a story, and like ideally you are genuinely curious about the perspectives of anyone mentioned in a story. And you give people time to respond to those requests for comments, and like there are just certain norms that are baked into the process. And I do worry about, non journalists just like not having those norms baked in. I mean, sometimes I just see like with commentary on Instagram and things like that, people just like, I don't know, getting over their skis, or like kind of maybe like I think there's reason we have institutions, and I think that those institutions, when they function well, can do really good things. But I also think that like there have been just holes in stories and perspectives that like have not been reflected in mainstream outlets. Or I also just like I like more voices. I like hearing from more people, and I think that like non journalists but writers in that area can like really serve that well. I'm trying to think. I was gonna look at my subscriptions. I subscribe to like many Substacks that are like all about various aspects of social science and academia. One person I really like, who I don't think considers himself a citizen journalist, but that I'll plug anyway, is let me find his name. Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist. He runs this newsletter called Small Potatoes, that it's not really about higher education, but like it'll sometimes be threaded in there. But it's about psychological research, and which has been, for people who don't know, has gone through like replication crises, basically, of like, like these studies are kind of not as rigorous as we thought, and they are not holding up to scrutiny, and like, oh, like what does that mean for like all this research that we've built? Is it all a house of cards? Like, it's going through its own kind of credibility crises as journalism. And he is really good at kind of giving his perspective on things, and like trying to figure out who to trust and why, and just like what's interesting to him and what's not. So I read a lot of stuff like that, and I think that that can be a really valuable like thing in the like ecosystem, I guess, that exists.
You don't have to tell me now. You can tell me afterwards if you'd like. But I'm curious in these kinds of characters in K-12. There's Corey DeAngelis on the right. He's got 200,000 followers, and he's often finding abuse or sexual predators in schools. He's an unabashed school choice proponent, but he has a reach and engagement that most journalists would, give an arm for. There's a woman named Laura Powell who sometimes leads the way reporting stories. Remember last year there was a superintendent who turned out not to be here legally in the country. Laura, to my understanding, broke the story. Are there any other folks, and again, if you want to tell me about them afterwards, that's fine. Are there any other folks out there who are doing reporter-esque things?
Yes, actually, now that you said that, that jogged my memory. John Seiler, I think it's Seiler. We've talked, so sorry, John. He is at the Manhattan Institute, and he has filed more FOIAs related to university like DEI hiring practices than like anyone else. Like he saw this opening, which was this issue was not being really talked about or written about by most like higher ed journalists. And he has like unearthed some really fascinating stuff. I mean, a lot of his records related to Ohio State. He was gracious and sent them to me, and that ended up being a big part of a story I just wrote about discriminatory hiring practices or possibly discriminatory hiring practices, I should say, at Ohio State University. And so he's a big one. He's a good follow. But there are definitely people at like think tanks. I'm sure I could think of others at places like the Manhattan Institute that are like spotting issues that have been undersung in like the mainstream press. And he files FOIAs and then he writes up what he finds, I think in like the Wall Street Journal opinion section and some other places.
And is generally reliable based on what you've seen of his work so far?
Oh yeah, totally. No, he files these requests. He's diligent about them. I think he'll talk to people on the campus too. Sometimes he'll get comment from the universities. So yeah, he's acting as a reporter. He's like doing reporting while he's working for this like think tank.
One last question, and thank you so much for talking with me and sharing your thoughts about this. Last year's EWA conference and awards both came under scrutiny from the right for what was perceived as bias. The panel topics, the sponsors, the panelists, and the stories that were recognized. I'm curious whether you think that we who know and love the education beats, certainly know and love it, want it to be as good as it can be. Should we be, in particular, careful about bias issues, or do you think that it's just sort of a generic issue to journalism?
Oh, no, I think education especially should be like nervous and pay attention to bias issues. And I think that because like during COVID, I think there were areas of life that fell under intense scrutiny, and education is one of them. And like I don't cover K-12, but like I think that a lot of people started paying way more attention to like what's being taught and why in K-12 classrooms when their kids were home and they were seeing like on Zoom what their parents or what their teachers were teaching. Similar to higher education, like I think more scrutiny really ramped up because there was criticism of like expertise in general, and like COVID is just like totally underexplored phenomenon that I think is affecting all of us in all these ways that we like kind of like to forget. But yeah, I think that Education Writers Association, and I should say I actually received a fellowship from them a few years ago, so just so people can kind of know my bias there. But like absolutely should be concerned about bias, because like the most fraught, the most impassioned fights that I see going on in culture over like what values do we teach children or students, or what we fund with public dollars, that's all happening in education, right? And so it makes sense to me that, like, as journalists and just as an organization, you really, really want to pay attention to that. And you want to be the place where people come to, like, figure out these arguments and, like, to argue with one another. And I think that that means, like, opening doors, being very welcoming to conservative critics and to conservatives in general, and wanting them to have, like, a seat at the table, because I'm sure for a long time they felt like they haven't.
Right. From your mouth to EWA's ears, Emma, congratulations on your recognition. Thanks so much for talking with me here. For folks who want to find or follow your work, tell us where to find and follow your work. And again, thank you so much.
Sure. Well, here comes the awkward part of this conversation. Though I love education journalism and have loved it, I am leaving the Chronicle.
Oh, no. Oh,
So
no.
yeah, I actually, my last, after I've worked here for like 8 great years, it's been lovely. My last day is Wednesday, the 22nd of which is in 2 days from this conversation. I am joining an audio journalism company called Longview. They've done some really cool
Okay.
things. The team there did this really popular podcast called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. They did The Last Invention about AI,
Mhm.
and they have this show called Reflector that is meant to embody the values that we've just talked about, like looking at debates, our most pressing societal debates, with an open mind, hearing out people on the left, on the right, on the center, and trying to give people something to think about and to reflect upon without necessarily forcing them into what to think. So I will be covering education stuff there, but I also be broadening my horizons a little bit. So you can still find me on Twitter. I'm at Emma Jane Pettit. But then my new email address, if people want to pitch me stories or reach out, I'm at emma.pettit, Pettit, at longview.report. So yeah, that's it's funny. I was pleased to be invited on an education podcast. But yeah, kind of ironic that I'm leaving the nest.
It's no problem at all. Longview.report.com.
Just
I
longview.report.
just want to make sure. .report. Okay.
Yep.
Um, uh, 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 I'm sad for the education beat, but I'm excited for you. It sounds like a really interesting opportunity, and how nice to have your reflections and lessons from your time on the beat. So thank you nonetheless, and congratulations.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me.